Hi, I'm Tim Janisewski, and welcome to our ongoing study as we spotlight Matthew with this Lectio Continua, that is, that ongoing continual reading of this book of the Bible, the first gospel from chapter 1 through chapter 28. Again, thanks for joining us for this, and hope you are being blessed and edified in your spiritual walk of faith. We actually find ourselves at a juncture today. We have just finished the great Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 through 7. And we're about to turn to another section of Matthew in chapter 8, verse 1 through chapter 9, verse 34. But before we dive into this next section, I want to back us up and show us the structure of what Matthew is trying to help us to understand. You'll remember that Matthew is both an historian. He is telling us the facts about Jesus, the history about Jesus. It is dependable, it is factual, it is something that is verifiable, that we can stake our trust in. It's not mythology, it's not something being contrived in the mind of Matthew that never happened. There is a historical Jesus. But secondly, Matthew not only is a historian, he is a theologian. He wants us to understand who Jesus is and what Jesus came to do. And I mentioned many devotions ago that I think that Matthew chapter 4, verses 12 through 25 is underrated, highly underrated, and very significant for the structure and the themes that Matthew, the theologian, wants us to understand in his gospel. And we saw back in chapter 4, verses 12 through 25, that were 4 items having to do with Jesus' ministry strategy. The first of them is that Jesus had a target, Galilee of the Gentiles, Galilee in the north. Second, Jesus had ministry tactics. This is his approach to ministry. We saw that there are 2 tactics that Jesus emphasized. The first tactic is that Jesus proclaimed the gospel of the kingdom in the cities, in the towns, and even the villages. He was consistent in his proclamation of the good news. And Jesus' second ministry tactic, or means, if you will, was to do mighty works to validate and verify his mighty words. He was healing people with all various kinds of diseases, and they were bringing people to him, and whomever he touched, whomever he chose to heal, was indeed restored by the power of God in Jesus Christ himself. So we move then from his target, Galilee, his tactics, which were his proclamation, and secondly, his mighty works. Third, to his team, which were the disciples. 4 of them were called back in these verses in chapter 4. And then finally, the terminus, the outcome. Great crowds were following Jesus, and his fame was spreading throughout the region. And then what Matthew does, and I understand this is kind of like Bible study for geeks, but hopefully you will enjoy it. It'll help you understand Matthew a little better and your own faith because of Matthew better. What Jesus then does in chapters 5 through 7 is give us a sampling of Jesus' first tactic. Jesus proclaimed the gospel of the kingdom. And what is the Sermon on the Mount? It's Jesus' proclamation of the gospel of the kingdom. And the mighty crowd sat and listened to Jesus as he did so. Well, Jesus' second ministry tactic was his mighty works. And we find in chapters 8 and 9 that Matthew now turns to give us a sampling of those mighty works. We'll find in chapter 8, verse 1, the mighty crowds listened to Jesus' mighty words, and now they are going to experience Jesus' mighty works. And the structure of chapter 8, verse 1 through chapter 9, verse 34 is actually to give us a series of these mighty works. What you're going to see is Jesus is shown to have power, first of all, over diseases. Second of all, power over demons in deliverance ministry. Third of all, he even has power over death itself. And then fourth, Jesus has command over the power of nature. So look at for the variety that Matthew gives us in the sampling that is set before us. And Matthew is going to give us 10 of these mighty works, these miracles. They're going to fall, first of all, into a group of 3. And then there's a little interlude. And then there's a second group of 3 more mighty works, and then there's a little interlude. And then finally, Matthew rounds it out with a last group of 4. It actually presents as 3, but one of the episodes has 2 healings occurring in it. So we actually come to a total of 10 mighty works by Jesus. It's only 68 verses, 34 verses in chapter 8, and then 34 more in chapter 9. And what I'd like to do is commend to you that you read this in its entirety. Read it as a united segment. Do not read these as just random stories here and there. No, Matthew puts them in very intentionally into this section. And I think you'll appreciate it better because you'll see how the mighty works of Jesus now being exemplified stand right behind and underpin the mighty gospel teaching that we have just concluded. And that takes us back then to that frontispiece, that starting point in chapter 4, where we learn of Jesus' target, his tactics, his team, and his terminus. So have all of that in mind as you read. And also let me mention there are 2 sub-themes that are going to start to develop in chapters 8 and 9. You heard that I mentioned that there are interludes along the way between the groupings of 3. Well, in those interludes, first of all, you're going to see that Jesus starts to talk about discipleship some more. Remember, Jesus was calling a team, and you're going to hear a little bit in the interludes about those who are not going to be on Jesus' team, and then who Jesus calls to have on his team. And that's going to springboard you actually into chapter 10. This all goes together. Matthew was brilliant in the way that the Holy Spirit led him to compose the first gospel. So you have that sub-theme in here of discipleship. The other sub-theme I ask you to look for is that there will be the first evidence of some opposition by the religious leaders against Jesus found in chapters 8 and chapter 9. And that's going to blossom when we get to chapters 11 and chapters 12. So I want you to see something of the way in which Matthew is giving us a rollout of the gospel of the kingdom in Jesus' mighty words and his mighty works as well. So today's devotional, just an introduction, just to set the page for you. And actually in the next devotion, we are going to jump in and go piece by piece, miracle by miracle through chapters 8 and 9 to see what it tells us more about who Jesus is and what Jesus came to do. So take this first reading, use today's devotion to read chapter 8 through chapter 9, 34, and be ready to see what the exciting things are that the Holy Spirit is going to reveal to us about Jesus and how that's going to apply to our Christian experience and our Christian practice as we do so. So remember always, you can check us out on spotlightgoodnews.com.